Hello, Theodore Shoebat here, giving you guys another message that you will not hear at church. I guarantee that. Today, I'm going to be giving you guys a little bit of a history lesson. And as I talk, I'm going to go a little freestyle. I'm just going to read, give some historical facts, give some historical lessons, and then give my thoughts on it. Give you guys historical lessons in light of what is currently happening. So talk about history and connect it and parallel it with current events. So what is currently occurring in our world right now. And when you read history, one thing that you realize is that history doesn't really repeat itself. However, it more so rhymes, right? It doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So in other words, it doesn't happen exactly the same way. Like you'll have an historical event like a world war, and then another historical event happens that's similar to it, but not entirely the same. There's always differences in detail. But nonetheless, there are enough parallels to go by that when the event does happen, you can compare and contrast it with the prior event. So this is why studying history is so important. In fact, I would say that the study of history is the most important genre of education. And so right now I'm reading this book. It's called The Deluge by Adam Tooze. And it is an excellent book. Please don't ask me, Theodore, what's the name of that book? Just pause the video, look at the title. The Great Deluge. The Deluge by Adam Tooze. Kind of rhymes, actually. But he gives you a very, very in-depth history. I mean, each page is packed with tremendous amounts of information, dates, names, meetings, quotes, all that stuff. And it's a very in-depth history on the post-World War I war. So what happened during the First World War, what was going on during the First World War, and then a huge chunk of the book is what happened immediately after. So all of the political technicalities, all of the meetings, the treaties, all that stuff. It goes into great detail. And it explains a lot on the rise of nationalism in Germany. So I marked the pages that have the information that I want to talk to you guys about. And it's very interesting. For one, this is on page 311 of this book, and it talks about how the unification of Germany, or how the unification of Germany really. Someone's knocking on the door. It's my cat. 1 second. All right, I'm back. Sorry for the disruption. My cat wanted to come in. I guess she wants to hear the history lesson as well. But this part of the book talks about how the unification of Germany would be dangerous to Europe, right? And it's saying this through the perspective of an Italian politician. His name was Francisco Nitti, and he was a prime minister of Italy after the First World War. And it's very interesting what it says here. The new prime minister pointed out that the treaty provision barring any move to unify Germany and Austria would mean that whatever the terms of the settlement with Yugoslavia, Italy's borders would be the most secure in Europe. Very interesting. The prime minister believed that as long as Germany was fragmented, the rest of Europe would be safe. Peace would be guaranteed within Europe. And it's very interesting. This actually parallels to something that took place after the Second World War, in which you had Margaret Thatcher, who was very, very worried about the reunification of Germany. So in the 1990s, the United States, with the help of Ronald Reagan and all that, Gorbachev tear down this wall and all that, that led to reunification of Germany. So the reunification of East Germany and West Germany. East Germany was under Russia, under Communist Russia, the Soviet Union. And so with the fall of the Soviet Union came the reunification of Germany. And Margaret Thatcher, she stated several times that with the reunification of Germany will come the revival of a militarist Germany, the restoration of militarism in Germany, the restoration of German power in Europe. And so you could laugh it off, but I think Margaret Thatcher, I think she knew what she was talking about. I mean, she lived there. She lived through the war. She understood it. She was a high-ranking politician. She had intelligence in regards to things of this matter. And so she said, with the reunification of Germany will come the revival of German supremacy, political supremacy, imperialistic supremacy, all of those things. And interestingly enough, she believed that the only power that would be able to counterbalance a reunified Germany will be Russia. So, like I said in my prior video, in Europe, there are these two pillars of power, Moscow and Berlin. And if you have a conflict in Europe, each country will have to pick a side. Either you're going to be with Berlin or either you're going to be with Moscow. And it was really that way in the First World War, and it was that way in the Second World War as well. You had this competition between Moscow and Berlin. During the First World War, Moscow, the Russians, were just whooping the Germans and Austrians' asses. They were dominating them. They were dominating the Austrians. And so you had the revolution in Russia, and that greatly vitiated Russia. It greatly weakened Russia, and that eventually led to the murder of the Tsar, and then the Germans supported the Bolshevik revolution, the Bolshevik takeover of Russia. Why? Because they wanted to cancel out the great pillar of Europe, really the major competition to Germany. That was Russia. And the Germans, even before the First World War, the Germans were talking about how they were going to dominate Europe, and they concluded the best way to do so would be first to cancel out Russia. You have to neutralize Russia. And then after we neutralize Russia, then we can easily deal with Great Britain and France. And if it wasn't for the United States, Great Britain and France probably would have lost the war, because they were in some deep, deep trouble during the First World War, and it was very difficult for them. In fact, they had to borrow tremendous amounts of money during the First World War. After the First World War, Great Britain and France and Italy were hugely indebted to the United States because they owed tremendous amounts of cash to Wall Street. So America played a huge role in the First World War. But again, the biggest competition, the biggest threat to German imperialism was Germany. The same thing could be said for the Second World War. And the same thing could be said for right now. That's why I think Germany is just so pissed off about Russia taking over Crimea, because they know, oh my goodness, the biggest competition we have in Europe is invading, or has invaded, our puppet. I mean, the Ukraine is essentially a German invention. As a result of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty during the First World War, in which Russia was giving a tremendous amount of its territory to Germany, a huge chunk of its territory to Germany. Germany carved out the nation of Ukraine. So the Ukraine was a puppet state for the Germans. So here is Russia invading the Ukraine. And what I believe is that when Russia invaded the Ukraine, when they took over Crimea, it was not just for Russian expansionism, for the sake of Russian power, but it was also to send out a message to the Germans that we are going to take back what you guys took from the Bolsheviks, what the Bolsheviks wrongly gave you during the First World War. So what you're seeing is a revival of, or really a uncovering of old rivalries. George Friedman, a very intelligent geopoliticist, makes a very interesting point. He says that all the old hatreds in Europe never went away. They're still there, but they're hidden. So what we're beginning to witness is an uncovering, an unveiling of the old hatreds. And here is Russia telling Germany, the head of the EU, we're going to take back the land that the Bolsheviks wrongly gave you. We're going to expand into it. This is our message to you that we haven't forgotten. But nonetheless, it's very interesting what the former Prime Minister of Italy, Francesco Nitti, said in regards to German unity. He said, as long as Germany wasn't unified, peace would be guaranteed in Europe. But what do we have now? We have a reunified Germany, which means that peace is not guaranteed. And this is not only from the observation of Francisco Nitti, this is also from the astute wisdom of Margaret Thatcher. And believe me, I've criticized Margaret Thatcher before. It's not like I'm worshiping her. I made a video a while back ago criticizing her for giving weapons to Indonesia when they were slaughtering the Catholics in East Timor. So it's not like I love Margaret Sanger. I'm simply pointing out the fact that she was a high-ranking politician, therefore she had an intelligence in regards to geopolitics, and I think that she had an astute understanding of the imperialistic aspirations of Germany. I think that's a fair and adequate observation. Here's another observation. Here's another part of the book. This is from page 316 of The Deluge by Adam Tooze, and it says here that the Versailles Treaty, which was the treaty that was done after the First World War, it says here that the Versailles Treaty did at least offer the chance of preserving the German nation state intact. So in other words, after the First World War, there was the Versailles Treaty, which was the peace treaty that was made after the First World War. And Germany said, listen, we want peace. We don't want to fight anymore, right? So the Americans essentially said, you want peace? Fine, but there are certain things that you need to do. One of them was to get rid of the Kaiser. Kaiser was the German way of saying the Caesar, Wilhelm II. He was literally the Caesar of Germany. He was a dictator. And what the United States did to Germany after the First World War was very similar to what the United States did to Iraq in the early 2000s. They invaded Iraq and they said, you need to get rid of Saddam Hussein. You need to get rid of the dictator. So the Americans got rid of the dictator, Wilhelm II, and they said, you now need to have democracy. Well, that pissed off a lot of Germans, because a lot of Germans, just like how a lot of Iraqis wanted their dictator, a lot of Germans wanted their dictator as well. It was cultural. And there were people who revolted. There were many soldiers. There were many naval soldiers who revolted. There was even a terrorist attack, a huge terrorist attack, on June 21st, 1919, in which you had a bunch of, I think they were like German soldiers. Yeah, they were German soldiers, and they were led by Ludwig von Reuter. And what Ludwig von Reuter did was he led an attack on the Kaiser's ships, because the Kaiser's ships at that time were being superintended by British soldiers. And these German nationalists didn't like that. So they went to the ships and they sunk them. And it says here that though British Marines struggled to prevent this violation of the armistice, killing 9 German seamen in the process, the Germans managed to sink the vast bulk of the Kaiser's navy, 15 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. The largest loss of ships on any single day in the annals of naval history. So more ships were lost in that one day than any other day in naval history. And that happened in the 20th century. And it was done by these German nationalists. They were pissed off that they lost their Kaiser, that the Americans were now imposing democracy on them. And so similar to what happened in Iraq. The Iraqis didn't want democracy. They wanted their dictator. A lot of them did. The opportunistic Iraqis, the ones who had very nefarious goals, they embraced democracy in order to usher in Islamicism. So very, very parallel. Very parallel. Similar to how the Nazis would use democracy to advance their own agenda, to advance their own political party. So in this Versailles Treaty, the Americans and the British, because really the Versailles, the meeting that was conducted to establish the Versailles Treaty was really ruled by the Americans and the British, right? The Italians didn't really have much of a say-so. The French didn't have much of a say-so. The two dominant forces were the Americans and the British. And they told the Germans, you have to pay an incredible amount of money. It was like 120 billion sterling or something like that. And you have until like 1951 to pay it. So the deadline was the 1950s. I believe it was 1951. And not only that, not only was money demanded, payment, compensation demanded from the Germans, but also German sovereignty was taken away. So a huge chunk of Germany was occupied by British troops. And you know how the British had all of these colonies. They had a lot of colonies in Africa, they had colonies in Asia. Well, the British would take men from these colonies and integrate them into the British Royal Military Force, right? The British Royal Army. And so you had these Senegalese men, these men from Senegal, from Africa, with British uniforms in German territory. And the Germans were just so pissed about this because it's like, who are these black guys ruling over us? And there were stories. I don't know if these stories were true, but these stories did spread around, and they were very effective as propaganda, as nationalist propaganda. But there were these stories roaming about saying that Senegalese soldiers, black, African, British soldiers, were raping German women. Now, whether or not these stories are true, I'm not sure. I don't know. I can't confirm them. What I do know is that these stories were made for propaganda. And so the Versailles Treaty, the anger toward Versailles, the Germanic anger toward Versailles, was not so much money as it was racial pride. Who are these Africans in our country? Not only that, but there was a region that the Germans claimed for themselves. It was called Cilicia. And the Allies, the Entente, and the Americans, they gave Upper Cilicia to Poland. And then they gave a city that was claimed by the Germans, although I think it was populated by a lot of Polish people. It was called Danzig. And the League of Nations, which was like the EU of that time, the League of Nations said, all right, we are going to now operate over Danzig. So Danzig became a territory for the League of Nations. And they gave Upper Cilicia to Poland. So Upper Cilicia had German inhabitants, but then all of these Polish people began to move in. So here are the Germans who believe that the Poles are an inferior race. In fact, there was not just the Germans believe this, but the English also. There was even a British military officer by the name of Jans Smuts. Jans Smuts. I have to look up his name. Yeah, Jans Christian Smuts. And he was a South African and British Commonwealth statesman, military leader, and philosopher. And do you know what he called the Poles? He called the Poles kafir. Literally, kafir, which is an Islamic term. You know, the word kafir is like spread all over the counter-jihad and the blogosphere. It's a household name now. Kafir is the Islamic term for unbeliever. But it is also an Islamic term to denote that one is inferior. Like it's like comparing someone to cattle, right? So you're like an animal. You can be kidnapped, killed, raped, enslaved, sold in the bazaar. Doesn't matter. You're not really a human being. You lose all human dignity once the title of kafir is placed upon you. And so when the Europeans went into Africa, they adopted this term. They learned it from the Arabs. Because when the Arabs went into Africa, they called the blacks the kafir. So the Europeans, specifically the British, the Dutch, the Germans, when they went into Africa, they picked up this term as well, and they began to use it to refer to people or anyone who they deemed as inferior. Not just blacks, but also Polish people. So Jan Smuts called the Poles kafir, inferior people. And the Germans, not all of them, but people in the elite circles, saw the Poles as mongrels, a degenerate race, a mongrel race, a race of people who were white, but they were also mixed with Mongol. They were not really true, pure Aryan people and all that garbage. So to the Germans, it was humiliating to be living amongst these Poles, and it was also humiliating to have a bunch of black guys with British uniforms roaming about their country as part of an occupation force. So it was racial pride, more so than money. I mean, yes, the money, over $1 billion something sterling, it was a huge prize for them because the Germans were reduced to poverty. And I'm not sympathizing with the Germans. I mean, they started the war. They made a lot of orphans. They made a lot of widows. They attacked cathedrals. So to hell with them. I don't give a crap about that. I don't even sympathize with them because they started the war. They caused all this destruction. They should have paid compensation. It was only natural. I mean, you lost the war. You lost. You got your ass whooped. So you're going to get occupied. It's just the natural result of losing. And it's also a just due punishment for all the crimes that it committed. So I don't sympathize with the Germans as well. I'm simply stating historical information in regards to what actually took place. So the Germans were pissed off about Versailles. It was humiliating. They were the superior race. They butchered tens of thousands of blacks. For example, they butchered the Herero. They butchered the Nama. Why? Because they considered the blacks to be inferior. And that was before the end of the First World War that the Germans did this. They actually had concentration camps in Africa. They even conducted human experimentation on Africans because they considered them inferior people. Now you have Senegalese British soldiers in your country occupying your land. So it just pissed them off. And it was used to foment nationalist hatred for Poles and for blacks. Oh, look at this Senegalese guy. He raped a German girl or something like that. We're being invaded. We have no sovereignty, etc., etc. This type of propaganda was being distributed throughout Germany. And it was very effective. It was very effective. It was used as fuel to reinvigorate nationalist pride against the Americans, against the Europeans, and all these things. And that's not to say that the Germans hated the Americans. In fact, they saw them with awe. And the author of this book, Adam Tooze, he explains that initially the Germans expressed admiration for the Americans and the British as great military strategists. But later on, the anti-American hatred, the anti-British hatred, the anti-French hatred came about. But the hatred for the Senegalese, the idea that, the Senegalese were, taking us over, and the Poles and these black people were taking us over. It reminds me of what a German politician said recently. His name is Andreas Scheuer. He is the General Secretary for Bavaria's governing Christian Social Union, which is the sister party for Merkel's party, the Christian Democrats. And this is what he said, quote, "The worst is a football-playing, altar-serving Senegalese who has been here for 3 years as an economic refugee. We can't get rid of him." So, interestingly enough, after the First World War, there was this idea. We have these Senegalese people in our country. We have to take it back. We have to go back to nativism. We got to go back to this identitarian philosophy, racialist identitarian philosophy. And here you have a politician in a very powerful party called the Christian Social Union saying something eerily similar. Not towards a Senegalese British soldier, but towards a Senegalese immigrant. Oh, the worst thing ever is this altar-serving Senegalese. And excuse me, I thought it was about Muslim migrants. No, no, no. He's attacking a Catholic Senegalese people. So they don't care if the people are Muslim. They don't care if the people are Christian. They have this idea that because someone is of a particular race, they can kill them. And it leads me to another observation. This guy is not even part of the AFD. The AFD, the Alternative for Deutschland party, it's supposed to be this right-wing radical party, which it is. And I have talked about the AFD in a great deal. But one point that I want to make is, if you look at the AFD, you look at the Christian Social Union, you look at the Social Democrats, you look at the Christian Democrats, what you will find are similar objectives, and that is remilitarization of Germany and racialism. You will see this in all of these parties. So it doesn't matter. It's like they all want remilitarization. And I wrote a very in-depth article on this, a 34,000-word article on Germany and on the ideology of Germany and the roots of Nazism. And at the beginning of the article, I show how if you look at the left in Germany, or if you look at the moderate conservatives in Germany, or if you look at the far right in Germany, you will see similar aspirations, and that is remilitarization. The remilitarization of Germany. And NATO is pushing for the remilitarization of Germany. They want Germany to militarize itself. And you ask yourself, why the hell are they doing this? I mean, we had 2 world wars with these people. Why would you want Germany to remilitarize its country? Well, for one thing, it's been going through remilitarization for quite a while, probably since I think the 1950s or something. But the U.S., shortly after the Second World War, had no issue with Germany remilitarizing itself. In fact, there was a huge debate in Washington whether or not it should be allowed. And there was one party that said absolutely not, but there was another party that said yes, it should be allowed. Germany should be enabled to remilitarize its country. And the party of German remilitarization prevailed in Washington. And so the Americans, for a long time, have allowed Germany to remilitarize itself. However, slowly that may be, nonetheless, it has been enabled to do this. Now, why is America doing this? Probably because they want Germany to be a check against Russia. Again, there are these two powers, these two pillars of power in Europe: Berlin, Moscow, Berlin, Moscow. And so, if you want to dominate Europe, you have to either take control of either Berlin or Moscow. That's it. So it's not like, oh, let's use Great Britain to go against Russia. No, it's let's use Germany to go against Russia because that's that's one of the two greatest pillars of power in Germany. And so, as going back to the discussion here, as people in post-World War I Germany used the presence of foreigners and some of the supposed crimes done by foreigners to rejuvenate nationalist hatred, so you see German people, German politicians and activists doing a very, very similar strategy. Use crimes that migrants have done to justify Nazi ideology. And here's another interesting fact that not a lot of people talk about. After the First World War, there was actually a attempted revolution done by German communists. There was a lot of communists in Germany. And in fact, the communists, they were people who wanted Germany to essentially become a Soviet colony, right? They didn't want Germany to be 100% a sovereign country. They were loyal to the Soviets. They were loyal to the Bolsheviks. And around 50,000 German communists after the Second World War, I believe this was in 1918, on March 22nd, they took control of two industrial cities, the cities of Essen and Duisburg. And it says here that a desperate effort was made at mediation, but with 50,000 of its own men under arms, the radical left now wanted a trial of strength. Amidst bitter fighting and gruesome reprisals, tens of thousands of pro-government troops, spearheaded once more by the Freikorps, retook the Ruhr. The government side suffered at least 500 dead. Over 1,000 insurgents were killed, the majority of whom were executed after capture. So you had the rise of the left in Germany after the First World War, the socialists, and they were commies and anarchist types and all that. And they took control of two cities, Essen and Duisburg. And they attempted a communist revolution. They wanted to overthrow the establishment government in Germany at the time. And the establishment government reacted with force, and they won. Now, in those days, you would of course had to side with the communists. Well, not with the communists, sorry, with the Germans. My mind kind of got scrambled a little bit there. You would have had to side with the German nationalists. You would have had to side with the government. Of course, these communists are trying to invade your country. They're trying to destroy you. And it was very evil what the communists were trying to do. Nonetheless, the strong presence of communism in Germany was used as propaganda in order to justify another evil, and that is racialism, ultranationalism, social Darwinism, hence Nazism. So here's the thing, is when I say, listen, these people who come across as anti-immigrant, they're nationalists, they're all for like sovereignty and all this stuff, they talk about patriotism, these people point to a real evil in order to justify another evil. And this is the very, very tricky strategy. I mean, the strategy is so tricky, it's unreal. It's so tricky. It's like you feel like you have to side with them. You know, when they say, listen, these Muslim migrants, they're raping our women, they're slaughtering our people, blah, 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 they're doing terrorism. And you have to agree with the fact that, yes, this is happening. But what you have to watch out for, and what you have to make sure that you don't the trap that you shouldn't fall into, the trap that you by using your discernment should notice is the pointing out to an evil in order to justify another evil. So they will point out to terrorism, which is an actual threat. It does exist. But then they use that to justify racism, eugenics, social Darwinism. Now, when the Catholics in the Middle Ages, when they were dealing with Muslims during the time of Pope Urban II or Pope Pius V, or I'm trying to remember the other guy, Pope Calixtus III, when these popes were dealing with the Islamic threat, they never brought up race. They never brought up race. They never said, oh, our race is better than theirs, or this is the fight for the white race. They never talked like that. They said, we have to fight for the Catholic faith. In other words, they fought to defend a noble cause, and that is the cause for the Catholic truth, the cause for the Catholic faith. What these people are doing is utterly different, utterly foreign. In fact, the popes of the Middle Ages, if they saw how these people are talking today, they would have utterly condemned it. So they're using this as propaganda. And in a way, they're trying to force people to take their side, because no sane human being can ignore that there is indeed an Islamic threat. No sane human being can do that. So people get so caught up in this thing with the Islamic threat that their intellects, their vision, their discernment gets clouded. It gets clouded by fear. It gets clouded by paranoia, to the point where they can't even see that they're being manipulated. And there is mass amounts of manipulation taking place in the propaganda world. And you saw this with Brexit. You had Boris Johnson get up there saying that if we don't get out of the EU, then these migrants are going to take over. Turkey is going to join the EU. And if Turkey joins the EU, that means that Europe is going to be bordering with Iran. And Turkey would have the right to flood Europe with its citizens, and it's going to be extremely dangerous. And it scared the hell out of the Brits, and they voted for Brexit. And then what does Boris Johnson do after Brexit? He says, oh, Turkey should be allowed to join the EU. So there is mass amounts of manipulation taking place. And supposedly he was, he knew about the Islamic threat. He knew about the danger of bringing in hordes of Muslim migrants. And at the same time, Boris Johnson is proud of his Muslim ancestry. He went all the way to Turkey to investigate, to inquire deeply into his Muslim ancestry. Johnson is not even his real last name. I think his real last name is like Ahmed or Mehmet, something like that. He is in reality of Turkish origin. Most people in England don't even know this. So here he is talking about, the danger of Muslim migrants, and then all of a sudden he's fascinated with his Muslim roots. He's fascinated with Sufism, fascinated with all this crap, and at the same time trying to manipulating people to leaving the EU, to breaking and fragmenting the EU, and at the same time being very pro-Turkey, and at the same time bashing people for not wanting Turkey to join the EU. What the hell is going on here? It's manipulation. It's mass manipulation of the society to fragment the EU. Because once you fragment the EU, then you get rid of that which restrains Germany. And I'm telling you right now, you think you're so cool because you believe in the fragmentation of the EU? Well, do you know who else believes in the fragmentation of the EU? Turkey wants to see the fragmentation of the EU. Why else would they send all these migrants into Europe? Why else would Germany send these migrants into Europe? Because they want the EU to fragment. That's why you had over 300 or so EU parliamentarians vote in favor for an EU military as a result of Brexit. They wanted Brexit to happen so that they could vote for an EU military. They want to see the fragmentation of the EU. And even if the EU fragments, Germany's still going to be powerful. It's the wealthiest nation in Europe. It's the fourth wealthiest nation on earth. They're going to be fine. They don't really need the EU. So they get rid of the EU. So what? It's when you have a country when you have a country that is that powerful, that is that wealthy, it has the means to form other alliances. It can form a Northern European alliance or a Central European alliance. Wouldn't be that difficult for Germany to do that because you're going to have nations that would still remain loyal to Germany. And here is the last page that I want to talk about on this book. Very interesting. People think that Nazism just popped up. Right? They think, oh, it just popped up. It just came about. There was a slow process. And it was a result of a slow process. Even during the end of the First World War, most Germans wanted peace. They didn't want war again. They didn't want, oh, let's go invade everything again, let's go back to war. They didn't want that. They wanted peace. And there were numerous states in Germany that said, listen, we need to agree with Versailles, or else we're not going to have peace. That's why the majority of the German officials signed Versailles. They agreed to Versailles because they wanted peace. And of course, you're going to have people say, oh, no, Versailles was bad. Please, spare me that garbage. And so, last year, 2016, Germany had its elections. And what dominated the elections in Germany? The Social Democrats, which is the left. What got second place was the Christian Democrats, which is the moderate conservatives. And then third place was the Alternative for Deutschland, which is far-right ultranationalist. It's very interesting. As the Social Democrats, I think it's called the SPD, dominated. Christian Democrats get second place, AfD gets third. So after the First World War, there was an election. In June 6th, 1920, 28.5 million Germans participated in the election. And it says here that the 80% turnout delivered a body blow to the founding parties of the Republic. From a commanding share of 75%, the Reichstag majority coalition of SPD, Center Party, and Democratic Liberals stumped to less than 45%. So they got less than 45%, but still they got a substantial amount of the vote. Punishing the SPD for its complicity with the counter-revolution, the voters of the left made the USPD, which is the socialists in Germany, into the second largest party in the Reichstag. So the SPD Center Party coalition gets first place, the socialists get second place. And then meanwhile, the intransigent nationalists of the German National People's Party surged to 15%, as well as the conservative right had done in any German election since the days of Bismarck. So at that time, people probably would have argued there's not going to be another war. I mean, people were arguing that. That's why they called World War I, though. They were calling it the war to end all wars. It was going to be the last World War. Europe would never face something like it again. And at that time, if someone were to say, no, it's going to happen again, people could have easily pointed out to this election, and they could have said, well, hold on a second. Social Democrats, which are a moderate left party, they got less than 45%, which is still a good amount. The Socialists got second place, and the right wing only got 15%. The far right, the ultranationalists, those Nazi-type guys, they only got 15%, so what are you talking about? But it grows. It grows. At first, the majority of Germans want peace, but then you have the anger coming out, and it escalates, and it escalates, and it escalates. And every year, these social Darwinist type parties, these eugenist parties, grow in popularity. So in Germany last year, they had an election, parliamentary election, the regional election, and AfD got a good amount of the votes, but still, it got third place. And you could argue, you see, Germany's still sane, right? They voted for moderate left, moderate conservative, and the far right only got third place. But still, look at the facts. AfD dominated a whole German state, the state of Mecklenburg, and they got, I think, a little bit over 20% or so of the vote. So it is growing in influence. And I think as the years go by, we're going to see it becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And even if that doesn't happen, let's say if SPD continues to dominate or Christian Democrats continue to dominate, the social climate, the political climate of Germany is transforming in a sense that it is becoming more and more favorable towards militarism. So it doesn't really matter which party wins. Militarism is becoming favorable. And with NATO forces pushing Germany to remilitarize, it's most definitely going to remilitarize. It most definitely will. And I'll finish off with this. I went to the store today and I saw this magazine published by Newsweek magazine, and they issued out a copy on Nazism, right? And the title, the cover of it is self-explanatory. Some very interesting things that are found in this magazine, and I'm not going to give you everything. I think with every video I do on this subject, I'll read something from the magazine. But on page 16 of this issue of Newsweek, it has a quote from Joseph Goebbels. And if you read it now, and if you didn't know that it was Goebbels who said this, people who are reading current events would think this must be said by someone in some nationalist party somewhere in Germany or in Europe. And it says here, quote, "The German people is an enslaved people. We are just good enough that international capital allows us to fill its money sacks with interest payments. That and only that is the result of a centuries-long history of heroism. Have we deserved it? No, and no again. Therefore we demand homes for German soldiers and workers. If there is not enough money to build them, drive the foreigners out so that Germans can live on German soil." Doesn't that rhyme and echo with what we're hearing today? Doesn't it rhyme and echo with some of the jargon that we're hearing coming out of Germany today? Germany for the Germans, push all the foreigners out. And I know a lot of you people out there with your patriotic zeal, your patriotism, you'll applaud this. You'll say, yeah, awesome. Germany for the Germans, it makes sense. And in a way, it does make sense. But it's a cover. It's a front for something much more diabolical. And remember that the next time you hear this type of jargon. History doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. This is Theodore Shoebat. Hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You just heard some theology. God bless, and God be with us.